Join me as I take on the challenge of building a solid emergency fund in just 30 days. Let's see if I can do it. Having a solid emergency fund in place is essential for achieving financial stability and peace of mind. It's like having a safety net that catches you when life throws you an unexpected curveball. Without one, you're left scrambling to figure out how to pay for unexpected expenses, which can be super stressful. But with an emergency fund, you can breathe a sigh of relief knowing that you got some cash set aside to cover those surprises. I know it can be hard to prioritize building an emergency fund, especially when there are so many other financial goals you might be working towards, but trust me, it's worth it. Having that cushion of savings can make all the difference in your financial well-being. It's like having a backup plan just in case something goes wrong. So what exactly is an emergency fund, you might be wondering? It's a dedicated savings account that's specifically set aside for unexpected expenses like car repairs or medical bills. The idea is to have enough money saved up to cover 3 to 6 months of living expenses, so that if something unexpected happens, you don't have to go into debt or drain your other savings accounts. Imagine being laid off from your job unexpectedly and having to rely on your emergency fund to get by until you find a new job. Or picture this, your HVAC system breaks down in the middle of winter and you need to shell out thousands of dollars to replace it. Without an emergency fund, these scenarios can be super stressful, but with one, you can rest easy knowing that you've got the money to cover those expenses. Let's talk about some common scenarios where an emergency fund is crucial. When medical bills are a big one, even with insurance, unexpected medical expenses can add up quickly. And if you're like most people, you don't have a spare $1,000 lying around to cover those costs. An emergency fund can provide peace of mind knowing that you've got some cash set aside to cover those unexpected medical expenses. Job loss is another major reason to have an emergency fund. Losing your job can be a huge financial blow, especially if you don't have a financial safety net to fall back on. With an emergency fund, you can take some time to figure out your next move without stressing about how you're going to pay your bills. Home repairs are another common scenario where an emergency fund can be a lifesaver. Whether it's a burst pipe, a broken furnace, or a leaky roof, unexpected home repairs can be super expensive. And if you don't have an emergency fund, you might be forced to put those expenses on a credit card, which can lead to debt. Car repairs are another common scenario where an emergency fund can come in handy. Whether it's a blown transmission, a faulty engine, or just a simple tire blowout, car repairs can be a major financial burden. And if you don't have an emergency fund, you might be forced to take out a loan or put those expenses on a credit card. Natural disasters are another reason to have an emergency fund. Whether it's a hurricane, a tornado, or an earthquake, natural disasters can be devastating. And if you don't have an emergency fund, you might be forced to take out a loan or rely on credit cards to cover those expenses. Utility bills can be another unexpected expense that can come up. Imagine if your power went out in the middle of winter and you had to shell out thousands of dollars to repair or replace your HVAC system. Without an emergency fund, that could be a major financial burden. And then there are appliance failures. We've all been there, whether it's a broken fridge, a malfunctioning washing machine, or a faulty dishwasher. Appliance failures can be super frustrating. And if you don't have an emergency fund, you might be forced to put those expenses on a credit card, which can lead to debt. Pet emergencies are another common scenario where an emergency fund can come in handy. Whether it's a broken leg, a serious illness, or just simple vet visit, pet emergencies can be expensive. And if you don't have an emergency fund, you might be forced to put those expenses on a credit card, which can lead to debt. Travel interruptions are another reason to have an emergency fund. Whether it's a cancelled flight, a hotel mistake, or just a simple travel delay, travel interruptions can be super frustrating. And if you don't have an emergency fund, you might be forced to put those expenses on a credit card, which can lead to debt. Tax emergencies can be another unexpected expense that can come up. Whether it's an audit, a tax bill, or just a simple tax mistake, tax emergencies can be super stressful. And if you don't have an emergency fund, you might be forced to take out a loan or rely on credit cards to cover those expenses. Funeral expenses can be another unexpected expense that can come up. Losing a loved one is never easy, and the last thing you want to worry about is how you're going to pay for the funeral. With an emergency fund, you can take some time to grieve without stressing about how you're going to cover those expenses. So how can you get started on building an emergency fund? First, you need to determine how much you need to save. As I mentioned earlier, it's a good idea to aim for 3 to 6 months of living expenses. So take a close look at your budget and figure out how much you need to save each month to reach that goal. Next, you need to decide where to keep your emergency fund. I recommend opening a dedicated savings account specifically for your emergency fund. This will keep your savings separate from your everyday spending money and will help you avoid the temptation to dip into your emergency fund for non-essential expenses. Now that we've talked about the importance of having an emergency fund, let me share a personal story that illustrates just how transformative it can be. A few years ago, I went through a really tough financial time. I had just lost my job and was struggling to make ends meet. But because I had an emergency fund in place, I was able to take some time to figure out my next move without stressing about how I was going to pay my bills. It was a huge relief, and it taught me just how important it is to have a financial safety net. Having an emergency fund in place can be a total game changer. It reduces anxiety, provides financial flexibility, and prevents debt accumulation. And the peace of mind it brings is priceless. So let's recap the key points we've discussed. Having an emergency fund is essential for achieving financial stability and peace of mind. It provides a financial safety net in case of unexpected expenses and can help reduce anxiety and prevent debt accumulation. To start building an emergency fund, you need to determine how much you need to save and decide where to keep your savings. Then make it a priority to save a certain amount each month until you reach your goal. Don't wait any longer to start building your emergency fund. Take control of your finances and start working towards a more stable financial future. If you've had an experience with an emergency fund, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you're new here, be sure to check out my video on budgeting tips for building an emergency fund. It's packed with practical advice to help you get started.